Welcome to episode 151 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show the public who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and the personal case reviews of my former colleagues who served in the FBI. Today we get to speak to retired agent Debra LaPrevotte, who served in the FBI for 20 years. She spent most of her career working international corruption investigations. In this episode, Debra LaPrevotte reviews the initiation of the FBI's Kleptocracy program and seizing more than $1 billion from corrupt foreign officials, including recovering $630 million of Nigerian government funds stolen by the former president of Nigeria. Debra, who has a master's degree in forensic science, also talks about serving for several years on the evidence response team at the Washington field office and at the FBI laboratory, and training at the body farm. Later in her career, Debra served as a Supervisory Special Agent in the International Corruption Unit at FBI headquarters. Since retiring from the Bureau, Debra is a senior investigator for the Sentry, which seeks to disrupt and ultimately dismantle the network of perpetrators, facilitators, and enablers who fund and profit from Africa's deadliest conflicts. You are going to really love this episode. During the first half, we're talking about international corruption, and in the second half, we're talking about recovering human remains. It's a jam-packed episode. But before we get to the episode, I want to congratulate my Twitter friend, author Meg Gardner, who has been named as the president of the Mystery Writers of America. Congratulations, Meg. I know you listen to the show. Mystery Writers of America has been very good to me. As a matter of fact, my next book, FBI in Film and Fiction, A Manual for Armchair Detectives, is based on a presentation that I did for the New York chapter of Mystery Writers of America on cliches and misconceptions about the FBI in books, TV, and movies. And I will make sure to acknowledge that in the book. So congratulations, Meg, on hitting up an organization that welcomes new crime writers with open arms. I also want to give a shout out to Sasha. Sasha was kind enough to tell all of her friends over at Web Sleuth about FBI Retired Case File Review. So if you're a new listener, especially if you came from Web Sleuth, welcome, and thanks again, Sasha. I want to invite all of you to join my reader team, where you'll get access to the FBI Reading Resource, which is a list of books about the FBI written by the FBI agents who have appeared on this podcast. We have over 45 books, crime fiction, true crime, and memoir. You'll also get a copy of the 20 cliches and misconceptions about the FBI in books, TV, and movies. You can join by going to my website, jerrywilliams.com. Or if you're listening to this on a podcast app that supports links, just go right to the description of this episode to join my reader team. I'll talk to you about my crime fiction recommendation after the interview. Thank you, and here's the show. I am excited to introduce my guest, Debra LaPrevotte. Hi, Debra. How are you?
I'm great, Jerry. How are you?
I'm doing great, and I am so happy to have you here with us today because you have had a fascinating career. You have worked international corruption, specializing in kleptocracy, which I know has a root spelling similar to kleptomaniac, so it has something to do with stealing. You have also spent many years on an evidence response team specializing in collection of evidence from decomposing bodies. We will definitely spend some time talking about that. And because this is FBI Retired Case File Review, we will review a couple of cases from both of those programs. And as a tease, I can tell you that one of those cases involves a kidnapping victim named Lucy. Why don't we start with an explanation of what kleptocracy is?
Well, kleptocracy is really the investigation of individuals who are in a position of leadership, usually the leaders of countries, presidents, premiers, dictators, who utilize and abuse their position as leader of their country to steal the country blind. And there are numerous examples of that. President Yanukovych out of Ukraine, President Obiang out of Equatorial Guinea, Dos Santos out of Angola, the current situation that's in Venezuela with President Maduro. And it's to the detriment of the people of that country. So it's the leadership of a country that is stealing money for their own personal gain, much to the detriment of the people and the responsibility that they should have to the people of their country.
So what unit in the FBI is this under? Is this under a criminal division or is it under some type of international counterintelligence division?
Well, it's under the criminal division, and it's like at headquarters, it would fall under the International Corruption Unit. But when I started out in 2002, getting my first case, kleptocracy wasn't a word that was even used then. It was just really international corruption. And my first case was, I think, opened in 2003. I was asked to try to recover $240 million that was stolen or paid to a prime minister, Pavel Lazarenko, out of the government of Ukraine. He was being prosecuted in California for laundering money in California and some other violations. They were only going after $40 million. So DOJ called me in Washington and said, Debbie, would you go after the other $240 million? And at that time, I was like, well, that's bigger than all my other cases put together. Yeah, of course I will. And so Lazarenko was my first, what would now be called kleptocracy case. The case isn't finished today, and it was initiated in 2003. But myself working with DOJ, we did recover $258 million of Pavel Lazarenko's money in a civil forfeiture case. And today that case would be called a kleptocracy investigation.
Well, now I have a lot of questions. First of all, you were saying that you initiated this case while you were in headquarters, and that's a little different. Usually, headquarters is involved monitoring a case that's worked in the field. So could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes. Well, actually, when I opened the Lazarenko case, I was in a field office. I was at Washington field office. However, by the time I finished my career, my last 3 years were spent at the International Corruption Unit. And at that time, I was allowed to open HQ investigations into kleptocracy. The FBI was initiating a new program where they were starting up a kleptocracy program. But at that time, it wasn't fully formed. So for the 3 years I was at headquarters, I had, 7 or 8 open HQ cases. And they were difficult to work out of headquarters because I had none of the support apparatus that a normal squad would have to investigate. I had no analysts working with me. And so I had to reach out to units at headquarters or work closely with Washington field office analysts to investigate these cases. And then after I left Washington field office, those cases were handed over to investigators at the new kleptocracy and FCPA squads at WFO.
I understand the violation in the foreign country. So somebody in the Ukraine or Nigeria whose government is being raped of all of their funds and all of their money, that's a crime there in that country. Could you explain to everyone the violation here in the United States?
Yes. And there's several. So sometimes it's just money laundering. So when the proceeds of foreign corruption are used to purchase a condo in New York, a mansion in Los Angeles, to buy a vehicle, several former dictators of other countries or political elites have used their money to buy an aircraft in Oklahoma, which is where the FAA is situated. And in each one of those cases, when you take the proceeds of a foreign corruption or a foreign crime and you move that money through U.S. financial institutions or use it to buy property or aircraft or yachts in the United States, you have violated U.S. law by money laundering. Sometimes it is the Hobbs Act violation. Frequently, it's just the proceeds of money laundering. Sometimes the overt act of purchasing an aircraft in the name of an LLC, knowing the true beneficial owner is a foreign kleptocrat, constitutes money laundering, especially if you can prove that the proceeds are directly traced back to their criminal conduct, embezzlement, procurement, fraud, theft of government funds. And that case would be opened as a kleptocracy investigation, but money laundering is the violation. And the money is usually recovered through a civil forfeiture investigation.
How much of investigating this type of violation has to do with relationships with other foreign governments and the State Department? Because it sounds like it's something that we also do as a benefit to our partners in other countries.
It's actually mutually beneficial. First, the United States is a signer on the UN Convention Against Corruption, UNCAC, and that makes us obligated to assist our foreign partners. We have signed a treaty as the United States saying that we will fight corruption. And secondly, the U.S. has venue because so much of this money is stolen in U.S. dollars, which means every time the funds are transferred, it is moving through a U.S., even if it's electronically, moving through a U.S. financial institution, a correspondent bank account. So many of our corrupt foreign leaders have children going to school in the United States, or they want to buy something, whether it's property in New York, LA, wherever, or an aircraft or a yacht, and they ended up buying it in the United States. Both President Bush and President Obama said that the United States will never be a safe haven for kleptocrats or their money. And so on all those different fronts, the United States is obligated to try to help our foreign partners, but equally, we don't want the proceeds of foreign corruption to be buying property in the United States. A good example is 3 years ago, there was a 70% increase in the sale of luxury properties in California to Chinese nationals. So your first question is, okay, China's a communist country. Who has millions to billions of dollars to be buying property in California? So immediately you're going to start looking at, well, who is buying those properties? Are they people that work for the government of China? Are they kleptocrats? If they're only getting a salary of the equivalent of $50,000 a year, how are they affording a $20 million mansion in California? You know, those types of stories come up where we see that proceeds of possible criminal conduct in another country are being offshored into the United States. The impact on the U.S. is huge. Imagine if 70% of the properties in California are now being sold above market value and for cash. That affects everyone else in California who's trying to buy a home now, because they can't compete with someone coming in from China with $20 million cash to buy the property. So it has a lot of impact on the U.S. economy.
Oh, it certainly does. I mean, I never really thought of it that way. So how do you investigate that? How do you trace? I guess the most important thing is tracing the funds. I mean, I worked economic crime for most of my career, and I understand how to do that here in the U.S., you know, with our subpoena power, et cetera. How do you do that on an international basis?
It takes a lot longer, but the paper trail exists. So if I have a subject in the Ukraine and they are wiring $20 million to a bank account in the Cayman Islands, those funds are likely to hit 3 different banks in the United States en route. So the bank account in Ukraine has a U.S. correspondent account. The bank account in the Cayman Islands has a U.S. correspondent account. And it will also probably hit the Fed Reserve or CHIPS clearinghouse in New York. So for that one wire transfer to make it from Kiev to the Cayman Islands, it probably hit 3 locations in the United States where I can, through a subpoena, try to obtain those records. while at the meantime, I am also getting an MLAT request going out to both Ukraine and the Caymans to obtain their bank records.
And MLAT stands for?
Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty.
Okay.
And so we have mutual legal assistance treaties with, 100 countries. Not all countries, but most countries. And that obligates them, like it obligates us, to try to work together on investigations. There's also Egmont requests. An Egmont request goes from our FIU, FinCEN, to the FIU of that country, where I can request information from FIU to Financial Investigative Unit, our FinCEN, to the Financial Investigative Unit of the other country. That will allow me to obtain a lot of information that is lead information only. But once I have that information, then I can back it up with a MLAT request for documents. And that process is slow. And so it could easily take me more than a year to get records out of a foreign country.
I guess one of the most difficult things for me to understand is how this coordination happens, because in many situations, it's actually the leaders of that government, for instance, the president or, a high military official that is involved in stealing, these funds. So how do you get cooperation?
Well, it's interesting because if the United States and international law prohibits people from going after the sitting head of state of a country. So like Robert Mugabe was the president of Zimbabwe for over 38 years or so. So while he was the sitting president, I could not investigate him. I could investigate people in his cabinet, the vice president, the Ministry of Petroleum, the Minister of Economics, but I could not investigate the head of state of a foreign country. However, in the case of Sani Abacha, Abacha was the president of Nigeria until he died in office in 1998. When he died, he was known to have taken $5 billion in both theft of money from the government and another 2.3 million in bribes, billion in bribes and kickbacks. And so when he died, the new Nigerian government reached out to all of its foreign partners and said, hey, the last regime robbed us blind. Could you help us recover the stolen money? So Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Lithuania, the United States, Austria, Germany, Canada, all of the foreign partners looked through their suspicious activity reports, through any reporting that they had, to see if they had funds related to President Abacha in their banks. And if they did, sometimes those governments took the steps to freeze those funds and then conduct the investigation that would be needed to try to trace the money back to criminal conduct and repatriate the money back to that country.
What did we find that we had here in the U.S.?
Well, in the case of Sani Abacha, the United States has filed against $630 million. In the case that I had, $480 million of that has already been forfeited. And our U.S. government is now working with the government of Nigeria to return those funds in such a way that we can see that there is a benefit to the, so the money doesn't disappear again. We want to make sure that that money goes to benefit the people of Nigeria. And the other $150 million is currently being litigated.
And what about property?
There was no real property in that investigation. So it was all bank accounts. And even then, the money that I seized was not in the United States. It had moved through the United States maybe 20, 30, 40 times in different transactions to 100 times. Just the fact that it had moved multiple times through U.S. financial institutions, that there were emails and other activity that occurred to within the United States gave us venue. And I filed a complaint in REM, which is a seizure warrant complaint, in Washington, D.C. for bank accounts in other countries.
When we talk about greed, this is the ultimate level of greed, because it sounds like these leaders are taking more money than they could ever spend, and probably in some situations would have lost track of where the money is.
It is astronomical sums. I think I started the Abacha investigation in 2008, And that was the first case that I had where I had to stop saying millions and start saying billions. But even his 5 billion was by no means the largest case after that point. Several years later, President Yanukovych and I think 60 members of his cabinet fled Ukraine. And during his presidency, it's estimated that greater than $10 billion left Ukraine. The FBI right now is investigating the one MBD case out of Malaysia, where the former prime minister of Malaysia took more than $5 billion. The FBI has already seized $1.8 billion to date, and the investigation is continuing. I'm sure other countries will also be seizing funds. That's a great investigation because some of the money out of that was stolen out of Malaysia was invested into a movie company in California that produced The Wolf of Wall Street.
Wow, that's fascinating. And so how do you even attempt to recover or recoup some of those funds, or do you?
You do. I mean, as I said, the FBI has already seized 1.8 billion of the 5 billion stolen. You know, I have no idea what other countries have already filed against, and the FBI is continuing their investigation against additional assets. And that's a perfect example of impact. That prime minister has been removed from office in Malaysia. The new Malaysia regime in Malaysia is cooperating with all of its foreign partners trying to recover some of that $5 billion. And in that case, not only did it move through U.S. financial institutions, but it was actually invested into a movie. And literally, it makes all of the money that one movie generated, all of the proceeds from The Wolf of Wall Street, technically are the proceeds of crime. Because if not for the investment, the movie wouldn't have been made. It's like when a bank robber robs a bank and takes one of those dollars from the bank robbery and wins the lottery, then the entire lottery winner's money is the proceeds of the crime. Because if not for robbing the bank, he wouldn't have had the dollar. And if not for the dollar, he wouldn't have bought the lottery ticket. And so that makes his $1 million lottery win seizable.
Wow. You know, we've been talking a lot about what happens here in the U.S. when these millions and billions of dollars are stolen. But can we talk a little bit about how this type of theft at this government level, how kleptocracy works when we talk about fueling war crimes and atrocities? That, to me, is one of the deadliest, most devastating parts of this type of crime. Could you talk to us about that?
I'd be happy to. And there's unfortunately so many examples of this, but after I retired from the FBI, I was hired by a group called the Sentry. The Sentry is co-founded by actor George Clooney and African activist John Pendergast. And we investigate the greed that fuels war crimes and atrocities. So South Sudan is a perfect example of a kleptocracy. President Kiir, the president of South Sudan, in the 13 years that he has been president of South Sudan, he and hundreds of people within his regime have allegedly stolen billions. And right now, more than half of the population is living outside of the country or living in refugee camps in Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, and Congo. Most of the country, a good percentage of it, are facing starvation because of the money that's being stolen is not only lining the pockets of a kleptocratic regime, but is also being diverted to stay in power, to buy weapons, to fund militias, to exacerbate the civil war that's going on in South Sudan. And so the impact on the civilian population is that thousands and thousands and thousands of women have been raped by the soldiers in South Sudan, and yet not one prosecution against a rapist who raped a local civilian. Thousands, millions of people, villages displaced because of the civil war going on there. And it all links back to a corrupt regime. No one under the President Kiir regime has been prosecuted successfully for corruption. And yet billions of dollars have been siphoned out, stolen, embezzled. People are removed from office only 6 months later to be put into a new position. South Sudan is the poster child for kleptocracy. And there's others, Equatorial Guinea, President Obiang, millions, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars stolen by that regime, while the average person in Equatorial Guinea lives under the poverty level. And that's just two examples. There's more. Look at Venezuela. The average Venezuelan has lost 20 pounds, literally starving. There was no food on the shelves, and you can directly link that to President Maduro's and his regime and the corruption that is going on. All of the money has been sucked out of Venezuela, and much to the detriment of the people living there. And that's really the picture of kleptocracy, where you have political leaders who are stealing money and looking out only for themselves, much to the detriment of the people that live in that country.
And I guess the way that it works is that they must get that money out of their country for two reasons, so that it can't be claimed if they're overthrown. Somebody can't just claim the money. And also because to enjoy the fruits of that massive wealth, they have to do it in another country because, as you said, their country does not have the infrastructure to, support a wealthy lifestyle.
Exactly. And so one of the Nigerians that I was investigating prior to leaving the FBI had bought 5 $25 million mansions in California. So is he fronting? I mean, it's hard to live in 5 different mansions. So is one of those his, and 4 others he's purchasing as a nominee buyer for a corrupt official? Dubai is the new Switzerland. So for years, all the corruption proceeds were hidden in numbered Swiss bank accounts. Well, now that money is being diverted to the UAE, to Dubai and Abu Dhabi. I recently read an article that 40% of all luxury condo sales in the UAE are to Nigerians. So if I was investigating Nigerian corruption, the first place I would be looking is at property sales in the UAE. So yes, they offshore. First of all, as you said, they want to live off the fruits of their theft. So they want a mansion, they want a Lamborghini, a Rolls Royce, a Porsche, a Mercedes. They want a Rolex watch. They want a lifestyle that they cannot otherwise afford. And obviously, if they do that within country, it's too public. So they set their wives and their families up in border countries or in the UAE and unfortunately, the US and the UK and Germany and Canada. And luckily, those countries, for the most part, have very good anti-corruption laws and forfeiture laws.
What else can be done? I mean, we're talking about the FBI and the investigative tools that are being used by the FBI and the Justice Department in order to find this money and to somehow safeguard it and return it back to a legitimate government in these countries. What happens when we locate the funds and there is no legitimate government to return it to? What happens in those cases?
Actually, there's several options. And so I'll address the first part of that, what the FBI is doing. And I have to say, I'm so incredibly impressed what the FBI is doing with this. So years ago, about a decade ago, the DOJ under AG Holder started a DOJ Kleptocracy initiative. So they increase the number of attorneys that are being the prosecutors on these investigations. The FBI, a few years later, just 3 years ago, started an FBI kleptocracy initiative. And what we have is dedicated squads in New York, Washington, I believe LA, with a few people in Miami, Houston, and Boston, who do nothing but work 2 violations: Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and kleptocracy, because often those 2 things go together. So in the last few years, since I've been retired, they've opened numerous high-level, like the Malaysia case, where they're seizing billions of dollars in foreign corrupt proceeds that are moving to and through the United States. In those instances where the United States recovers money and the current regime is still corrupt and we can't just give the money back, the United States, the State Department, DOJ, and other officials sit down with that government and say, and they try to work out a plan. What is the biggest need for your country? Well, maybe it's medical maybe you have a high infant mortality rate, you have an Ebola outbreak. So how about if the United States gives $100 million of the money we're returning to your country to Doctors Without Borders to be used only in your country to treat those things? Childhood mortality and an Ebola breakout, or a cholera outbreak, or basic nutrition. Money could be given to fight Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab. In one of I think it was either Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, one of the Tajikistan, one of the stans, the current regime was corrupt and the funds just could not be returned. So the DOJ worked with Switzerland and started the BOTA Foundation, BOTA Foundation. The money went into that foundation and was monitored but distributed to programs within that country. So the United States did not keep the money. The government worked with our foreign partners to make sure that the money went back to the people of that country in such a way that there was full visibility of how the money was being spent and what the benefit would be to the people of that country.
And who did you say is monitoring the use of the money?
Well, in that particular case, I think it was the World Bank.
Okay. Well, that's an innovative program because that ensures that the money is used for the benefit of the people, even when their government doesn't care.
Yeah, and in one of the things we try to make sure we get across to people is that the United States does not keep the money. We might take out some costs. In other words, the cost that it cost America to investigate the case, the cost of the attorney, the cost of the agent's time, that can be deducted from the total amount. But when you're talking billions of dollars you're trying to return to a foreign government, that it's a very minuscule amount. The rest is negotiation at a level much higher than myself between DOJ, the FBI, State Department, and the government that is seen as the victim in those investigations.
And what entity is it that makes that decision? Because now we've recovered, millions, billions of dollars that belongs to a particular country. The leaders of that particular country are deemed to still be corrupt. What entity has the authority to decide, no, we're not returning funds to this country because we don't believe that their regime will use it to benefit the people, that they will, again, just steal the money? Just for clarification, I'm wondering who makes those types of decisions.
Well, again, because the money is returned, it's just not a check to that regime. The money goes into a fund to be only used in that country. Like, as I mentioned, the one particular case where they had to start a foundation called the BOTA Foundation. But it's not one entity. It is DOJ with input from the FBI along with the U.S. State Department, because now it's a matter of diplomacy. It's like, we have the money, we would like to return it to you, but we want to return it in such a way because the United States government put a lot of time and effort into locating, seizing, and forfeiting those funds, that we want to make sure that they are used justly by the receiving country. So there are many instances where the new regime is a non-corrupt regime, and those funds are returned still in a manner where there has got to be transparency as to the distribution of those funds. But in the few instances where the regime is corrupt and those funds can't easily be returned, it is high-level meetings between DOJ, State Department, and possibly other entities working with that host government to give the funds back through either a foundation or through programs or something that is eventually mutually agreed upon. It could take a year or several years of negotiation to figure out how to return those funds successfully.
So I'm wondering if this would be an example, say in Sudan, where we have all of these camps where people are living and we have international care companies coming in to provide food. Is the funding for some of those?
Not necessarily. And that's an interesting point that you bring up, because frequently I'm asked, well, could that money go to victims of genocide, or could those funds, and it's like, and the answer is no. Because the reality is there's only a few regimes that are so corrupt that we couldn't figure out a way to give the money back with transparency. there might be a situation where that host government is spending a lot of money on those refugee camps, and they may agree, yes, if you're returning $500 million to us, we would like $100 million of that to help us pay for these 12 refugee camps that we are hosting in our country. And that would be an agreement between the United States and the victim country. But frequently you have to remember that when it's kleptocracy money, it is usually money that was stolen from that government. If it's a non-corrupt regime, we have every obligation, as if money was stolen from the U.S., the U.S. government would want that money back. A great deal of foreign corruption is contract fraud, inflated contracts, which means that victim country actually is out money. So every case is different. Every case has to be approached on a one-by-one basis. But in most cases, the United States and the victim country come to a mutually agreeable situation, and they figure out how best to return the funds that benefit, the people of that country, and where there is a great level of transparency as to how the funds were spent or where they went.
In investigating these type of cases, when you were with the Bureau, did that involve any type of international travel for you?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I was gone all the time. I was either at my desk or on an aircraft. And so, when I investigated Lazarenko, obviously I went to Ukraine several times to meet with my foreign partner investigators in Ukraine, because that was the source of the criminal conduct and I needed to obtain evidence. Lazarenko purchased a bank in Antigua. A lot of the money was laundered through an Antiguan bank. So I went to Antigua and I met with bankers and investigators in Antigua, and then Liechtenstein, Lithuania, and other countries, Botswana, Brazil. I mean, not just in the Lazarenko case, but I worked Bangladesh corruption. So I've been to Bangladesh 7 or 8 times. I testified in Bangladesh court in 2011 as a witness for the prosecution, testifying against the son of the former prime minister in Bangladesh. In that case, I also went to Singapore so that I could investigate money from Bangladesh that had been stolen and offshored in Singapore. Working international corruption cases required a lot of international travel.
When you talk about international travel, I understand that you assisted Brazil in a particular case, an interesting case.
Yes, I have to say, I laugh because people used to look at me and say, oh, you work forfeiture. And I'm like, no, you don't get it. I work forfeiture. I said, are you kidding? I get to seize the proceeds of foreign corrupt people. So I love my job. And one of the most interesting things I got to seize was a boa constrictor. I was called by DOJ, and they asked me, Debbie, would you help the government of Brazil recover a leucistic boa constrictor that was stolen from a zoo in Brazil? So after I Googled leucistic and found out that it means an animal or individual that doesn't possess the gene for pigment, which means it's better than albino. This snake was pure white. The snake's name was Lucy, but it was also called the Diamond Princess. And the zoo administrator in Brazil allegedly was selling off exotic animals for her own benefit, financial benefit, and saying that the animals had died. And one of the animals was a pure white boa constrictor. Well, needless to say, a short time later, a reptile looking exactly like the one in Brazil showed up in Utah. And an individual in Utah was now mating this pure white boa constrictor and selling its offspring at $10,000 to $15,000 per reptile. The original boa constrictor was valued at well over $100,000 as being one of the only leucistic boa constrictors known to exist in the world. So it was very interesting when it showed up on a boa constrictor website in Utah. And these are the kind of cases that people laugh about, but you just can't make up. The subject from Utah and his sister were trying to smuggle the snake out of Brazil. And the first attempt they were going to make was to smuggle it out in a fake pregnancy stomach. So they had, the stomach was empty. This was their trial run. They went to the cruise ship where they were going to try to smuggle it out on a cruise ship, because the security on a cruise ship is much more relaxed than an airplane or an airport. And when they got to the cruise ship, the sister looked 7 months pregnant, so they wouldn't allow her on the boat. So they had to go to the airport. When they got to the airport, they wanted to search her. She originally said, well, I'm a Muslim. I will only let a Muslim search me. And they're like, no problem. Fatima, come. And so then she had to come up with another story. So eventually they did search her at the airport. They found that she was wearing an empty fake pregnancy stomach. Airport security thought she was a drug smuggler. They detained them. They seized the fake pregnancy stomach. And the problem was they let them go because they didn't have any drugs on them. They kept the fake pregnancy stomach, and the snake was still in Brazil. So they moved the snake across a soft border into Guyana, bought a bunch of other boa constrictors, and shipped it back on an aircraft. The snake was now in Utah and being mated. The government of Brazil requested the assistance through an MLAT request to help recover the reptile. So I got the case. I was at headquarters at the time. So I'm like, yeah, okay, I can seize a boa constrictor. But first I had to make sure that the snake in Utah was in fact the snake from Brazil. So being a forensic scientist, I called the Smithsonian, talked to the reptile experts, and asked if I got a viable DNA sample, could they match it to the reptile in Utah? They agreed they could, but I couldn't get a viable sample out of Brazil. So next, I called the FBI's lab, and I asked if the facial recognition software could be used on a reptile. And they said, yeah, they thought it could.
Oh, my God.
Okay, we're good. So we talked to experts in reptiles from the Fish and Game who agreed to go on the search warrant with the FBI out of Utah. I wrote a seizure warrant affidavit for the snake and any of its offspring. Then we had to make sure the search team in Utah, they also had poisonous reptiles, so we had to know which hospitals carried anti-venom in case anyone got bit during the execution of the search warrant. The FBI Utah, they showed up, knock, 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 and announced, FBI, we have a search warrant. And when they opened the door saying we have a seizure warrant for this reptile, gentleman's 4-year-old son said, white snake died. And so the snake had died, but we recovered 8 of its offspring. We had to find a zoo that was willing to feed them, maintain them, quarantine them, keep them alive up to a year. And the Hogle Zoo stepped up and agreed to do so. And the U.S. Marshal Service, because it's an asset, managed that for us. One snake did die, but to my knowledge, 7 of the offspring were returned to the government of Brazil.
And was the person in Utah criminally charged with this?
Yes, he was. He violated many. I think the Lacey Act on smuggling endangered species, smuggling reptiles into the United States, possibly bribery of a foreign official, because the zoo administrator was a government official since the government owned the zoo. So, yes, he pledged charges in Utah.
You sent me a copy of the press release from the Department of Justice on this case, and it is pretty fascinating. So I will make sure that I put a link in this episode's show notes for anybody who wants to take a more detailed look at this investigation. One question I have for you is, what is the gestational period for a snake? Because this was a pretty profitable theft for him, that he was able to get all these little baby boa constrictors.
Unfortunately, I'm not a reptile expert. I don't know the gestational period of a reptile, but I do know that snakes lay multiple eggs. Any reptile, including like in the turtle, a turtle can lay 20, 30 eggs. Well, a reptile can lay several eggs. So it wouldn't be unusual to have 5 or 7 reptiles born from one litter of eggs.
All right. So we had to step back a little bit because you said something that I'm sure a lot of listeners, their eyes went open a little bit. And that's when you said that you were a forensic scientist. So we need to step back a little bit to the time when you first joined the FBI. How does a forensic scientist decide that they want to become an FBI agent?
Actually, I became a forensic scientist after I joined the FBI. So my first 2 years were in the Detroit division. I was transferred to Washington field office in 98. And 2 years later, I joined the evidence response team. I went back to school and got a master's degree in forensic science from George Washington University.
What was your bachelor's in?
Sports medicine.
Oh, okay.
So, I was always in science anyway. I was an exercise physiologist prior to joining the FBI. So it was a little change of career. But I love forensics and I love science. I took night school. I'd work all day and I'd run over and go to grad school at night at George Washington University in DC, graduating with a degree in forensic science, specializing in crime scene investigation. For the FBI, I was on Washington Field Office's FBI ERT team for years. And my specialty was human remains recovery and advanced human remains processing and post-last investigations. The FBI sent me to the body farm in Tennessee, where I went to human remains recovery school. They sent me to Boston to get advanced training and how to get fingerprints off of badly burned or decomposed bodies. I loved the work. I spent 2.5, 3 years on the evidence response team unit at the FBI lab.
Wow. You've got to tell us more about going down to the body farm and then going up to Boston to fingerprint decomposed bodies. The first question is why? What made you interested in working on an evidence response team and then concentrating on collecting evidence from dead people?
I love science, and really that's what ERT is all about, the science of crime scene detection. And evaluation. So as soon as I was eligible and at Washington Field Office, I applied to get on the evidence response team. They provide outstanding training for the members of the team. And then you have the opportunity to specialize. You could go and be trained in post-blast investigations. The FBI has dive teams, individuals who are trained in human remains recovery. Every year, the FBI sends 40 agents or so down to the University of Tennessee's Forensic Anthropology Department, and we attend Human Remains Recovery School. And it's a coveted class. There's a waiting list, so it's not just me.
And this was that body farm that you were talking about?
Exactly. And for a week, you learn everything there is to know about human remains recovery, everything from ground penetrating probes and looking for soil density changes when you're looking for a buried body versus perhaps new growth from a tree or a bush if the body's only been buried a year or two, to how do you excavate human remains? How do you tell human from non-human bones? We met with and we're trained by zooarchaeologists who would show us the difference between different bones. And we also were trained by an entomologist. So when how do you recover fly pupa? Which carrion beetles arrive first? Who lay their eggs first on human remains? So it's a really fascinating class. And if you like science, it's a great opportunity. And ultimately, the science outweighs the ick factor, because there is an ick factor. Human remains smell. There is the smell of decomposition, not pleasant to look at. My note to myself after I left the body farm was no rice or ribs for a week, because, after a week of recovering maggots off of human remains, they're photolight sensitive. So you don't see them during the daytime. They go inside, and at nighttime, they come back out. So all of us had to know how to recover maggots and fly pupa. So it was an excellent opportunity for training, and unfortunately, training that the FBI gets to use a lot.
There's a whole section about the body farm on the FBI website with some really cool video. So if anybody wants to check that out, I'll make sure to include a link in the show notes for this episode.
It was a great opportunity. I was trained there, and then I went back 2 years later and was an instructor.
And what was the training that you went to in Boston?
They took a number of us up to Boston for advanced human remains processing. And that was a 3-day course on how to get fingerprints off of badly burned or decomposed bodies. So there are a number of techniques that can be utilized even when the bodies are fairly badly decomposed to try to recover fingerprints.
And so we went up. You never know what's going to be in FedEx because a box arrived from the University of Tennessee's body farm, and it had 6 hands in it in different rates of either burned or decomposition. And we worked on those hands for several days, trying different techniques to successfully recover fingerprints from those hands, so that when you do come across a bombing, a decomposed body, you have different techniques and different skills to try to use to recover those fingerprints and try to identify a much faster way to identify a body while you're waiting for DNA.
So my question is, where do the bodies come from? Do you know?
Yes, I do. Because having been to the University of Tennessee's Forensic Anthropology Department, there's a hospital there, and the bodies are donated. So a lot of family members will donate their families to science, and it might be a 2-year or 3-year or 5-year donation where sometimes the bones are just kept permanently. Sometimes after 2 or 3 years, depending on what the bodies are used for, whether it's measuring the rate of human decomposition in different environments or bone studies, the remains can be returned to the family if they ask to be buried later. So the bodies we were working with are all donated to science.
Even those hands that you were talking about?
Yes, they would have come from one of the bodies that had been donated.
Theoretically, it does sound fascinating to me. But then I'm thinking, these were real people. So how do you separate the fact that you're looking at bones and decomposed tissue, but that was a real person? Did that ever come into play? Especially if you knew the story about what happened to them, how they got there.
It does, and I think it would be even worse when you're recovering the human remains for children. But for the most part, you realize that the work that you're doing is hopefully identifying somebody that nobody knew where they were and what was going on. So you're the next step in identifying someone's loved one. Maybe somebody's been missing for 3 or 4 years or a decade, and you excavate the human remains and recover them so that DNA can be done and their loved ones can be identified. So from a scientific standpoint, you also know that that individual is no longer there. Whatever makes them them has moved on. This is the opportunity to help identify them, especially if you're working a plane crash, a bombing. You were picking up barely identifiable parts, and the parts you recover may very well be what identifies someone's loved one. It is easy to separate the two for me and just get to the work at hand.
And I can understand that type of situation when you're responding to a disaster or a buried body from a kidnapping or a serial murder. But is there any situation where, and I don't know how else to say this, but where you're responding to a fresh murder?
You'd be surprised because we work a lot of MS-13, so I know that Washington Field Office has done a lot of human remains related to MS-13 homicides.
So how often would you go out with the evidence response team when you were assigned to Washington Field Office? And from what type of cases would you be collecting evidence?
Hands down, the majority of responses are to bank robberies. There is a bank robbed every day or every few days in Washington, D.C. At Washington Field Office, evidence response team members are on call, but your duty week is 1 week every 5 weeks. And you can guarantee that pretty much during that week, you will be called into 2 or 3 search warrants. 1 or 2 may be bank robberies, usually on a Friday afternoon, of course, while everyone else is heading home. And then we would also coordinate with the drug squads. If they were if there was a major white collar document search where you wanted people trained with the FBI's 12-step approach to processing a crime scene, photographing, sketching, documentation, we would respond to major drug searches, some of the higher profile investigations within Washington Field Office. We had a fly team, so some people would fly to bombings abroad, Pakistan or Afghanistan, or anyone involving a U.S. person. And other members of our team would fly when a U.S. person was killed abroad. And so we responded quite a lot. And I'm sure New York, LA, Miami, Washington all of the teams that deal with those types of crimes are responding frequently.
Well, ERT is a collateral duty in most cases, so that means that you were on the forfeiture squad when you were going out with the evidence response team.
Yes. So, I mean, it helped that you were only on call 1 week out of every 5, unless there was a major incident. And if there's a major incident, everybody's responding. 9/11, everybody dropped what they were doing and headed to the Pentagon. But in other situations, you may not have a call out for 4 weeks because you're not on call unless there's a major incident.
And did you respond to the Pentagon bombing?
Actually, I responded. I had got on evidence response right after 9/11. But yeah, I was at the Pentagon, and I assumed so much of WFO was. But I was told to respond within an hour of the plane hitting. I was at the Tyson's Corner, Northern Virginia RA at that time. And of course, wearing business appropriate clothing. And I was told to go home, change into khakis and gear and report to the Pentagon. And I did. So I was mostly doing interviews that day of witnesses and people that were being triaged and people that were there at the Pentagon the day it was still on fire when we arrived.
I'm assuming then that that's what sparked your interest in joining the evidence response team?
It was a big part of it. I mean, I had always, from the time I was a new agent, wanted to be on ERT. And I think back in the day, you had to be off probation. So I couldn't apply until after my first 2 years. And my first 2 years, I was in Detroit. And as soon as I got to Washington field office, I know I applied. I think there was a waiting list when I first applied for ERT.
Producing this podcast is a lot of fun, but I also get to talk to a lot of retired agents who tell me about things they did during their bureau career, and I have to admit, I get a little envious. Being on the evidence response team sounds like it was a pretty rewarding experience.
It was wonderful.
You had mentioned that when you were working international corruption, that you were always on a plane. I would imagine that when you're working evidence response, that you're also doing a lot of international traveling?
Not as much as you would think, because the FBI has flight teams out of New York, Washington, Miami, and LA. So depending on where the incident is somewhere in the world that requires the FBI to go to the scene, it depends on which team will fly. So there are times where I did have to deploy. One of those TV FBI moments. You get a phone call in the middle of the night. You have a few hours to be at the aircraft. I flew to Mexico City. I think it was 2008, 2009, when there was a plane crash that a Learjet crashed in Mexico City during rush hour. Washington field office sent a team of forensic scientists as well as the lab sending down a team. We flew down on the director's G5 to Mexico City, got on helicopters, taken out to the crash site, and we did total station. We mapped out the scene. And for 5 days, we did human remains recovery. We worked with the National Transportation Safety Board to try to determine the cause of the plane crash. Recovered the remains of the 8 people on board who died, 8 on ground who died, and 44 additional individuals that were injured. And ultimately, it was found that it was not a cartel hit against individuals on that aircraft. It turned out to be pilot error. But that's an incident where, at the time, President Calderon out of Mexico called President Bush and asked for the assistance of the United States to process this crime scene. So there was occasions where I was asked to travel internationally for ERT. The majority of my ERT work was done here in the United States. And once I was at the FBI lab, the majority of my work was training those agents in the field to respond to bombings, kidnappings, rugged terrain evidence collection, and also training new agents in evidence collection.
I would think that training agents, especially new agents, would be a really rewarding part of the job too.
It was a great opportunity. First of all, you just love to see the new agents. Most of them are learning about evidence collection and processing a crime scene for the very first time. Who knows what background they came from before they joined the FBI. And so you've got a new agent class, and you're trying to explain to them that just because you see a dead body doesn't mean you have probable cause to enter the house. Little things like you still need a warrant, right? The guy's dead. No exigent circumstances exist. explaining to them about plain view doctrine. If you can see something in plain view, then you have you can search there. That was really rewarding, and trying to teach them security, their own personal security. Like when you're there could be booby traps, there could be bombs in the house. What kind of search is this? Never assume that somebody's not going to be violent, whether they're a gang member or whether they're the president of a bank. You're about to negatively impact their life by doing a search warrant and arresting them. So there's a reason why the FBI is as good as they are at conducting search warrants. We do follow a 12-step program to make sure that we don't miss evidence and that it's cataloged, obtained, and packaged in the best way possible for use as evidence in the courts. And then we also got to teach advanced forensics to members that were already on the evidence response team, whether that was taking a new group of agents down to the body farm for human remains recovery school or post-blast investigation training, or we did a class on rugged terrain evidence collection. For instance, there were people shooting at both the Marine Corps Museum and the Pentagon several years ago. Well, if you have a bullet lodged in a window 2 stories up, do you try to go up in a cherry picker or do you rappel down from the roof? And if you're rappelling down from the roof, you are going to still have to photograph the scene, that's the window, recover the window, photograph the bullet with a scale. And so how do you process a crime scene when your crime scene is the side of a cliff, the bottom of a ravine, the side of a 4-story or 6-story building, the side of a cruise ship when someone has been tossed overboard or fallen overboard? I mean, there are crime scenes that aren't just a room. And so knowing how to process those crime scenes and understanding the value of evidence makes you better at recovering evidence, because you're like, wow, okay, I know the lab can do something with this, so I need to make sure I recover it.
You have had such a variety of experiences in the FBI, to go from forensic scientist, evidence response, and then this very complex investigation of kleptocracy is impressive, I have to say. What do you...
I think it's not that unusual. Well, what I found is, evidence response is a collateral duty, like several, like dive team or different other collateral duties that agents have. So all of us, wherever squad we get assigned to. And it's interesting. When I first was transferred to Washington Field Office, Washington Field had just set up a terrorism SOG squad. And my supervisor had to give up an agent, and I had been there a week, and he didn't know me, and he said, "Nice to meet you. You're now on that squad." And so, I took my box of goodies, desk plaque, name plaque, pen cup, and I headed to a new squad. So for the next 2 years, I was trained in surveillance techniques and how to be on SOG, and I worked terrorism matters as it relates to surveilling terrorists that might be in the Northern Virginia, D.C. metropolitan area. When I had the opportunity to leave that squad, I found there was an opening on a forfeiture squad. And my boss at the time said, "Well, you don't want to do that." I'm like, "I sit in a car for 8 hours a day. Yes, I do want to do that." And it was the best decision I had ever made, because I went to a squad that out of Washington Field Office that worked asset forfeiture and money laundering. And because Washington, D.C. has default venue, when the crime did not occur within the United States, but the money moved through the United States, D.C. has default venue. So I started getting all of the international corruption, kleptocracy, forfeiture cases, Lazarenko, Abacha, Bangladesh, Chad, Brazil. And it was the luck of the draw. I feel incredibly fortunate and blessed every single day that I not only met wonderful people on that squad, I worked incredibly great cases, and I got to work with so many agents in my field office, because there is forfeiture that can be done on almost every single case, but frequently the agent just doesn't have time to do it. And so to have another agent come behind them who was only concentrating on the money in their case. What did their subject buy? What does he drive? Where does he live? What kind of bank accounts? Does he have investments? Doing that aspect of their case for them, it was a real benefit to the agents at WFO. it was a model that I would hope would be mirrored by more field offices.
That's pretty fascinating. And I know that we've covered a number of episodes with case agents who talked about being forfeiture agents on an organized crime squad. So I can see how that is so helpful, because I'm sure agents who may be working on organized crime or a drug squad, again, when they hear about forfeiture and following, the following the money and finances, their head starts to explode, because that's not their thing. And to be able to have that type of support from another agent who is also looking at the criminal violations involved, that has to be almost kind of a relief to have those type of partnerships.
I think it was. And it allowed me to work with so many, on a close basis, with so many other agents at Washington Field Office.
So, Debra, this has been absolutely fascinating. As I mentioned before, you've had a really cool career in the FBI, doing some things that are different than what you see on TV and movies about the FBI. And I always like to ask that question: is there anything that you see, say, in a TV show, in a movie, that has to do with evidence collection that just makes you kind of roll your eyes and say, that's not how it works?
I would say, I'm a big fan of CSI, the original, not the 5 copycat shows, but the original. But yes, it's like they will be walking through a house with a flashlight when they could simply turn the light on. And, I get it's much more dramatic walking through a crime scene with a flashlight, but seriously, it's night. The crime's already happened. It's, obviously if you're there, you have a search warrant or some probable cause to be in the property. You're not looking for the suspect, and they're still walking through with a flashlight. And I'm like, but you could just flick the switch and turn the light on. Right? Because as all the ERT people out there know, you photo in and you photo out. So you should be taking photographs right now, and you can't do that with the lights off. It's that, or when people go into a crime scene by themselves,
Yeah.
I was at the academy watching Silence of the Lambs and laughing with the rest of us, thinking, sure, let's not get somebody with 20 years of experience. Let's pull somebody out of new agent class and have them investigate a complex serial murderer. And of course, she goes into a storage facility by herself. So, it's that kind of thing. Or, they're not wearing gloves. Our photographers are wearing gloves because somebody's going to have to touch something. And so, it's little things like that irk me when I'm watching some of the crime shows.
Now, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I do love the sound effects, though, that CSI, the original CSI show, they had great sound effects when a bullet is going into flesh or, I as a forensic scientist and somebody who spends a lot of time dealing with bones, appreciate that.
Many of those things that you talked about are questions that I have when I'm also watching a TV show and a movie. They could still make it very entertaining and exciting, but a little bit more accurate. So,
I hate that the FBI agent who shows up at the scene is usually portrayed as a jerk, or the female FBI agent that shows up in a tank top and stilettos, not average bureau wear, especially if you're about to process a homicide or a murder scene or a kidnapping. Some of it's amusing, some of it's a bad stereotype, but they're all entertaining.
Yes, they are. Talking about what you see on TV and movies. Did you see the movie The Kingdom?
I did not.
Well, it starred Jamie Foxx and Jennifer Gardner, and they were members of an evidence response team responding to a bombing in Saudi Arabia. And in the movie, Jennifer Gardner is actually collecting evidence from off of a dead body.
Oh, yeah, because you have to have them x-rayed to see if there's shrapnel. With the plane crash in Mexico City, we took the larger identifiable human remains to the morgue and had them x-rayed so we could try to determine if there had been an explosion on board the aircraft and if there were shrapnel in the human remains, or was it just a plane crash.
All right, so we're about at the end of our conversation here, but I do have a few quick questions. One of them is, when did you join the FBI and why did you join the FBI?
I joined later. I turned 35 at the academy. So I must have been 33 to 34 when I applied. I worked on the Norfolk Naval Base because I was DOD before DOJ. And I walked into a building one day. I just looked around and I said, I can't see me doing this for 20 or 30 more years. And I said, there must be some place where I can work where I'm surrounded by excellence. And that day, I decided I wanted to be an FBI agent. This is old school because it was the 90s. I went to the library and I checked out every book they had inside the FBI, a lot of Ron Kessler's books. I just read up everything I could on the FBI and I applied. I remember to this day, November 12th, 1995, I drove onto the grounds of the FBI Academy and I just said to myself, like, I did it. I'm here. And I was so excited. And I've never looked back a day since. I've been surrounded by excellence. I've met some of the most spectacular people in the world as my co-agents and support staff. The people I've had the pleasure and the joy and the honor to work with for the last 20-something years. My daughter now works for the FBI in Pittsburgh, and I couldn't be more proud. When people ask me about it, with all of our good and all of our bad, we're still the best organization. And we never cease to amaze me with the people that we hire and the investigations that we successfully bring to a conclusion.
Now, you had mentioned that you were an exercise physiologist and that you had been working in some type of a sports management.
Sports medicine. That's what I did for DOD. I was the fitness director on the Norfolk Naval Base, and I was using my sports medicine degree. I was the director of the fitness programs for the world's largest naval base. We had 100,000 people on board the naval station. One day I walked into one of my buildings and I just said, there's got to be someplace I can go every day and I'm surrounded by excellence. And that was the FBI.
So does that mean that when you got to the FBI Academy, you killed it when it came to the fitness tests?
I have to say, I may not have the record in push-ups as one of the female gymnasts in one of my other classes got. But yeah, I arrived fit. The PT program was not a problem.
Very good. I did the same. That's one thing that I recommend to anybody applying. That is under your total control. So
do not show up out of shape.
That's correct. Or even at the lower levels of the point system, go in there already at the very top, and that way you don't have to worry about that for the rest of the academy class. All right. So my last question then is, after your fabulous FBI career, tell us a little bit more about what you're doing now.
Yeah, I couldn't be more thrilled. As I was preparing to retire, I was contacted by a group called the Sentry. It's Sentry, and we're based out of DC. And we are a small organization, but we investigate greed that fuels war crimes and atrocities in Sudan, South Sudan, Central African Republic, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. So we don't just investigate greed. It has to be greed that is perpetuating atrocities, whether that is gang rape of civilians or perpetuating civil war, leading to starvation because the civilian populations have been displaced and nobody's growing food. It is phenomenal work. And right now, South Sudan, as I said, has more than half the population displaced, 2-point-something million people living outside of the country and living in refugee camps. They have been in civil war up until the last few months where there's been a tentative peace agreement signed. But the people that are still in country are starving. There have been thousands of women raped with no prosecution. There have been billions of dollars siphoned out of the economy there by kleptocratic regime without any prosecutions for corruption. So we investigate those allegations of corruption. We gather evidence. We turn it over to anyone who could do something with it. So we brief the National Security Council, we brief the UN, we brief the United States government and anyone in other governments. And we gladly turn over any of the evidence that we collect. Some of the information that we've collected out of South Sudan has contributed to the sanctioning of 5 generals and business people out of South Sudan who are perpetuating the current kleptocratic regime in that country and are responsible for war crimes and atrocities. So the biggest takeaway for me was not only am I doing good work, but it allowed me to just continue being an investigator.
It really sounds like the work that you did in the FBI was a great segue into what you're doing now in post-retirement.
I don't think I could have found a better post-retirement FBI job. I absolutely love what I do. The work that I do, I hope is meaningful and is contributing to the greater good, especially in Central and Eastern Africa. I'm thrilled. I work with great people. A lot of them are also former government, former Treasury, former State Department, former agency. We have a good team of people here that are dedicated to trying to make things better in Central Africa.
Well, 2019 is my year of social impact, and I have dedicated, my mission of showing the public who the FBI is and what the FBI does through these personal case reviews from retired agents such as yourself. But I do have to ask this very superficial question, and I apologize ahead of time, but have you had a chance to meet George Clooney?
I have. And yes, there are absolute perks for working for George Clooney. I got hugged by Mr. Clooney 2 years ago. I was thrilled. And, the thing is, he is absolutely as good looking in person as he appears on this big screen. But even better, he, Don Cheadle, Ryan Gosling, and other people who support the Sentry's work, they put their money towards great causes. Those individuals help fund the Sentry. They are the face of the Sentry that draw a lot of cameras to parts of the world that other people would not otherwise necessarily know about, read about, and be interested in. So they use their celebrity for a great amount of very good purpose. And so it's an honor working for him. And I have to say, John Pendergast is the other co-founder of the Sentry. And John has dedicated the last 30 years of his life to working matters in Africa and is an African activist who, every day his life is dedicated to working on these issues.
Well, I will make sure to put a link to the Sentry in this episode's show notes so that anybody listening to this will have the opportunity to check out the good works that the organization is doing.
That would be wonderful. Thank you.
So this is it. At the end of every episode, I like to give my guest the last word. So what would you like to say?
Actually, Jerry, I'll say what you were talking about. Your mission for 2019 is showing people what the FBI is really about. And that is a wonderful mission because so many people only know about the FBI from what they see on TV. And that is sometimes a very negative portrayal or a ridiculous portrayal or a Superman-esque portrayal of the FBI. To have people know that the average FBI agent and the average support person are just excellent people who dedicate, who could be out making more money elsewhere, but they don't. They're here at the FBI. They're working because they know that the work they do is integral to the United States and to the greater good of humanity. And so, I can't say enough good things about the FBI. Again, yes, we have problems. Yes, in any organization this big, you're going to have a problem. But on the whole, we have the greatest group of people who are dedicated to justice. The more you can get that word out to the average American citizen, I applaud your efforts.
And that's the end of the interview. Back at jerrywilliams.com, you'll find a photo of Debra LaPrevotte. You'll find articles about kleptocracy and the FBI's International Corruption Program. You'll also find articles and videos about the Body Farm. I hope you enjoyed the episode and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. If they don't know how to listen to a podcast, there's a post on my website that will tell them exactly what they need to do. And don't you forget to subscribe to FBI Retired Case File Review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. My crime fiction recommendation is a little different this week. I am recommending that you check out Michael Connelly's new podcast, Murder Book. The premiere episode came out this week. And if you love Michael Connelly's books, I'm a huge fan, then I think you're going to enjoy his podcast. So again, my crime fiction recommendation this week is Michael Connelly's new podcast, Murder Book. The first episode is about a carjacking and murder in 1987 Hollywood. My next book, FBI in Film and Fiction, A Manual for Armchair Detectives, will be available later this spring. Thank you for listening to the very end. If you want to support this podcast, I hope you consider picking up a copy of one of the crime novels in my FBI Philadelphia Corruption Squad series, Pay to Play and Greedy Givers. The crime fiction series features Special Agent Kerry Wheeler, Temptation, Corruption, and Redemption. The books are available as ebooks and paperbacks at Amazon.com, and Pay to Play is also an audiobook. I want to thank you for listening, and I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.